The morning of September 11, 2001, began like any other for millions of Americans. For the people of New York City, Washington, D.C., and the entire United States, it would soon become one of the darkest days in modern history. By the end of the day, nearly 3,000 lives would be lost, and the U.S. would embark on a path of global conflict and heightened security measures. The day started with clear skies and typical hustle and bustle. People went about their morning routines, commuting to work, sending their children off to school, and starting their day. However, just after 8 a.m. Eastern Time, the calm was shattered. American Airlines Flight 11, a Boeing 767, took off from Boston Logan International Airport, bound for Los Angeles. On board were 92 people, including 5 al-Qaeda terrorists led by Mohammed Atta, who had a clear mission: hijack the flight and crash it into a prominent target in New York City. By 8:14 a.m., Flight 11 had been hijacked. The terrorists overpowered the flight crew, taking control of the plane and changing its course. The passengers, unaware of the full extent of the situation, tried to communicate with loved ones through phone calls. One of these passengers, Betty Ong, was able to alert ground control about the hijacking, providing crucial information. However, the plane continued to make its way toward its target. At 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. The collision caused a massive explosion, sending debris and flames shooting out from the building. The impact immediately shook New York City and sent the country into shock. As the building burned, people inside the tower were desperately trying to escape, while first responders rushed toward the scene. The city was still grappling with the impact of the first crash when, at 9:03 a.m., a second plane, United Airlines Flight 175, crashed into the South Tower of the World Trade Center. Just like the first plane, the hijackers had taken control of the aircraft and aimed it directly at the tower. The explosion was deafening, and the damage was catastrophic. This second impact confirmed the worst fears of many. This was not an accident. New York City was under attack. The attacks were coordinated, and now the world knew that America was under assault. The Twin Towers, iconic symbols of New York's skyline, were on fire, and the world watched in horror as the tragedy unfolded. People on the ground ran for cover as debris fell from the burning towers. As the fires raged, the buildings began to weaken, and the collapse of the towers seemed inevitable. At 9:37 a.m., just over 30 minutes after the second plane had struck the World Trade Center, another plane, American Airlines Flight 77, crashed into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. Flight 77 had taken off from Washington Dulles International Airport and was en route to Los Angeles. The plane, a Boeing 757, was hijacked and diverted toward its target, the Pentagon, the nerve center of the U.S. military. The crash caused an explosion that rocked the building and ignited a massive fire. While the Pentagon's massive structure absorbed much of the impact, the damage was still severe, and over 100 people were killed, including both passengers and military personnel inside the building. As if the situation weren't dire enough, a fourth plane, United Airlines Flight 93, was also hijacked. This flight had departed from Newark International Airport in New Jersey, bound for San Francisco. However, unlike the first 3 planes, Flight 93's passengers were determined not to let the hijackers succeed. They quickly learned of the other attacks, and realizing the plane was headed toward Washington, D.C., likely to target either the White House or the U.S. Capitol, they took action. The passengers fought back against the hijackers in a desperate and heroic struggle. The cockpit voice recorder revealed their bravery as they attempted to regain control of the aircraft. In the chaos, the plane crashed into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 10:03 a.m., killing all 44 people aboard. Meanwhile, in New York, the fires inside the World Trade Center towers continued to burn. Firefighters, police, and emergency personnel rushed to the scene to rescue trapped civilians. However, the flames, fueled by jet fuel and office materials, made the situation nearly impossible. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower, which had been hit second, collapsed in a massive cloud of debris and dust. The North Tower followed shortly afterward, collapsing at 10:28 a.m. The Twin Towers, once symbols of American commerce and power, were reduced to rubble in just under 2 hours. The collapse of the towers was a horrifying sight, as massive plumes of dust and debris filled the streets of Manhattan. First responders and civilians were buried under the destruction. The scale of the devastation was unlike anything the country had seen before. In addition to the nearly 3,000 people killed in the attacks, thousands more would be impacted by the toxic dust and debris that spread across the city. Many first responders, as well as survivors, would later develop health issues from the exposure. As the world absorbed the shock of these coordinated attacks, the United States was thrust into a new era of counterterrorism and national security. The U.S. government responded with a series of actions designed to address the immediate threats posed by terrorism, as well as to prevent further attacks. In the immediate aftermath, President George W. Bush addressed the nation, vowing that the U.S. would hunt down those responsible and that the country would not be cowed by the attacks. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, quickly began an investigation into the perpetrators. It was soon discovered that the attacks were the work of the extremist group Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. The hijackers, all 19 of whom were members of Al-Qaeda, had been trained in flying commercial aircraft and had meticulously planned the attacks over several years. Within weeks, the U.S. military launched Operation Enduring Freedom, targeting Al-Qaeda's base of operations in Afghanistan, where bin Laden and his followers were sheltering under the Taliban regime. The war in Afghanistan marked the beginning of the U.S. War on Terror, which would lead to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and years of military conflict across the Middle East. The 9/11 attacks remain one of the most debated events in modern history. While the official narrative holds that the hijackers, members of Al-Qaeda, carried out the attacks, a significant portion of the public and certain experts have challenged this explanation. Conspiracy theories regarding the events of 9/11 range from doubts about the government's prior knowledge of the attacks to assertions that the U.S. government orchestrated the attacks themselves. One of the most prominent and widely discussed conspiracy theories is the idea that the U.S. government had prior knowledge of the 9/11 attacks and allowed them to happen, either intentionally or through gross negligence. This theory suggests that certain elements of the U.S. government, particularly within intelligence agencies, were aware of an impending terrorist strike and allowed it to unfold in order to justify military action in the Middle East and increase surveillance on American citizens. The phrase, "let it happen on purpose," has been attributed to critics of the government's response to the attacks, hinting at the possibility that the government not only knew about the attack, but may have used it as a pretext for a broader agenda. One book that delves into this idea is The Terror Conspiracy, Deception, 9/11 and the Loss of Liberty by Jim Marrs, a journalist and conspiracy theorist. Marrs writes extensively about the idea that the attacks may have been allowed to happen in order to further U.S. geopolitical interests. He suggests that the Bush administration may have used 9/11 as a justification for invading Afghanistan and Iraq. Marrs points out that the U.S. had been preparing for military action in the Middle East even before 9/11, citing documents that discussed plans for war in the region. One of the most chilling aspects of this theory is the suggestion that the CIA and other intelligence agencies had foreknowledge of the attacks. In Crossing the Rubicon, The Decline of the American Empire at the End of the Age of Oil by Michael C. Ruppert, the author argues that certain intelligence agencies were aware of the plot and intentionally allowed it to happen. According to Ruppert, the government's actions, or lack of action, prior to the attacks point to complicity or gross negligence at the highest levels. Beyond the idea of prior knowledge, one of the most persistent and controversial conspiracy theories involves the collapse of the Twin Towers. The official explanation is that the fires, ignited by the impact of the hijacked planes, weakened the structural steel of the buildings, causing them to collapse. However, some argue that the speed and symmetry of the collapse more closely resemble that of a controlled demolition, rather than a collapse due to fire damage alone. In The New Pearl Harbor, Disturbing Questions About the Bush Administration and 9/11's, author David Ray Griffin, a leading proponent of the controlled demolition theory, argues that the way the buildings collapsed is highly suspicious. Griffin points out that the collapse of the World Trade Center towers was incredibly fast and symmetrical, much like what is seen in controlled demolitions. He argues that this type of collapse is highly unlikely in a building that had been struck by a plane and subjected to intense fires. A critical point of Griffin's argument is the fact that both towers fell almost straight down. In a typical building collapse, particularly one that involves fires and structural weakening, there is usually some sort of leaning or tilting as the building gives way. However, in the case of the Twin Towers, the collapse occurred almost perfectly vertically, suggesting that the structure was being brought down from within. Griffin quotes experts like Dr. Stephen Jones, a physicist at Brigham Young University, who conducted his own investigation into the collapse of the towers. Jones argues that the temperatures caused by the fires in the towers could not have been high enough to weaken the steel to the point of collapse. He states, "The available evidence indicates that explosives were used in the destruction of the World Trade Center buildings, suggesting that demolition charges were placed within the buildings prior to the attacks." The idea of a controlled demolition is also discussed in Behind the Smoking Gun, 9/11ths Exposed by John L. McCain, who is critical of the official explanation for the Twin Towers collapse. McCain highlights the fact that there were numerous reports of explosions heard in the buildings before they fell. These reports came from survivors and first responders who were inside the towers during the attacks. While these claims are often dismissed by officials as the result of the chaotic environment and loud noises from the impact of the planes, conspiracy theorists point to them as further evidence of a controlled demolition. Another important piece of the 9/11's conspiracy puzzle involves the attack on the Pentagon. The official story is that American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the western side of the Pentagon, killing 125 people inside the building and 59 passengers on the plane. However, some conspiracy theorists argue that the damage to the Pentagon was inconsistent with a crash involving a large commercial airliner. In the Pentagon Attack Papers, author Michael Chossudovsky presents a critical analysis of the Pentagon attack. He suggests that the U.S. government's narrative of the crash is inconsistent with the physical evidence. Chossudovsky proposes that the Pentagon attack was either staged or covered up, and that the damage was caused by something other than a commercial airplane. Theories about Flight 93, the fourth plane involved in the attacks, have also sparked controversy. According to the official story, the passengers on Flight 93 fought back against the hijackers, preventing the plane from reaching its intended target, likely the White House or the U.S. Capitol. However, some conspiracy theorists argue that the plane was shot down by the U.S. military to prevent it from causing further damage. They point to the lack of wreckage at the crash site and the rapid response from the military as evidence that the plane was intentionally destroyed before it could reach its target. The 9/11ths Commission report, Omissions and Distortions, by David Ray Griffin, further explores the official narrative and claims that the story surrounding Flight 93 is incomplete. Griffin questions why the government has not released certain key pieces of evidence, such as military communications or radar data from the time of the crash. He suggests that the U.S. military may have been involved in taking down the plane, but that the government has deliberately obscured the truth in order to avoid creating further public unrest. These theories about the U.S. government's role in the attacks or the possibility of military involvement have persisted over the years, even as more evidence has come to light supporting the idea that Al-Qaeda was responsible for the attacks. However, the alternative explanations continue to challenge the official narrative and provoke deep questions about the U.S. government's role in both the events of 9/11s and the subsequent global war on terror. Will we ever know the truth?